Will this be recorded?
Yes, this will be available.
Okay.
And perhaps we'll have there's talk of maybe getting a podcast going for this. At least I've been talking about that. So maybe we should think about that. We might be ready for that step. But we are out of time. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and this is Wednesday Talk Radio. My name is Paul Rowland. Stay tuned for Political Perspectives.
Good morning. You're tuned to KBOO Portland. Here's what we have coming up for you this morning on KBOO. First, it's Political Perspectives, today featuring a lecture by Dale Resinella about his experiences as a death row chaplain in Florida for 18 years and his expertise on what the Bible says about the death penalty. At 10 o'clock, Chris Andre hosts Air Cascadia. At 10:15, Flashpoints features excerpts from Requiem for the American Dream, the new moving film about Noam Chomsky based on 4 years of interviews. And at 11 on the Recovery Zone, host Stephanie Potter interviews Perry Gruber, founder of the group Copiosis, a resource-based economic system about retiring capitalism and repairing our world. And thank you once again, KBOO members, for generously supporting KBOO Community Radio. You keep it alive here at KBOO. Thanks for that.
KBOO Community Radio is a proud co-sponsor of the United States premiere of Liza, 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 produced by Triangle Productions. The play runs from May 5th through the 28th at the Sanctuary at Sandy Plaza in Portland. Join Liza Minnelli at 3 different stages of her life, often all on stage at the same time, with plenty of songs, backstories about the iconic and troubled daughter of Judy Garland, with a bit of dancing and prancing and much humor among the frightening tales of drink, drug abuse, broken legs, strokes, and hip replacements. Again, that's Liza, 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 May 5th through the 28th at the Sanctuary at Sandy Plaza, 1785 Northeast Sandy Boulevard in Portland. More information can be found at kboo.fm on the right side of the homepage under Community Events.
And before we get to that lecture by Dale Resinella, we have this community announcement for you. Portland State University welcomes renowned author and journalist Ayelet Waldman to campus for the 2016 Sarah Glasgow Kogan Memorial Lecture. Waldman will speak on "There's No Business Like Shoah Business. Why is a nice Jewish girl from New Jersey so obsessed with her people's greatest tragedy?" Her remarks relate to her latest book, Love and Treasure. This event is free and open to the public on May 26th at 7 p.m. in Lincoln Performance Hall on PSU's campus, 1620 Southwest Park Avenue. Today on Political Perspectives, we feature a talk by Dale Resinella, the chaplain on death row in Florida state prisons for 18 years. He is the author of 3 books: The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty, Now I Walk on Death Row, and When We Visit Jesus in Prison. He spoke at Willamette University in Salem in March. His talk was sponsored by Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Thanks to Alan Taylor for his help with this program.
I guess you could say a subtitle of this talk is The Death Penalty Up Close. I'm going to try and take you through a series of quick pictures, like if you were on Facebook. of how the death penalty harms everybody that gets close to it. The main thing I'm going to focus on is taking you into the physical reality. My name is Dale Restinella. I am the Catholic chaplain for death row in Florida and have been for 18 years. I'm not the only one. There's a priest. In the last year, we've added a deacon. But for 18 years, it's been my responsibility to go cell to cell to cell to cell on Florida's death row. 400 men on death row. Also to cover solitary confinement, long-term solitary confinement, which in Florida is an additional 2,500 solitary cells. And these two massive prisons are right next to each other. They're so huge that they have to have separate administrations. But in terms of the programming of what they do, it's done as a single facility. And so I'm going to speak of them as a single facility because we're not talking about solitary confinement today. That's a whole separate issue. We're talking about death row and executions. A subtitle of my talk is "The Death Penalty Leaves No Survivors." Everybody it touches is harmed. We don't just minister to the inmates, we also minister to the staff, the officers, the people that work in the prison where people are killed by the state. We minister to the families of murder victims, the people who are promised that if you just stick in there for 10, 15, 20 years, stick with us, and when you see this man killed, you'll feel better. You'll feel closure. You'll feel healed. In a state where life without parole is the sentence for capital crimes, when the trial is over, there may be an appeal, but it's over. There's not an endless series of appeals because super due process only applies when the state's trying to kill one of its citizens or one of its guests. So with life without possibility of parole, there's the trial and it's finished. And the family of the murder victim then has the task of figuring out how to begin the journey of healing. When there's the death penalty and the person who killed their loved ones gets a death sentence, starting that journey of healing is on ice. It's on hold for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. While the death penalty system, which is an absolute morass of legal contradictions, winds its way through, and meanwhile this family is on hold. And the promise is it'll be worth waiting because you'll feel better when you watch this person be killed. I'm going to share some stories with you about how those families feel when they find out the state lied to them in order to get them to support going for an execution. I started this work in 1998. Before that, my wife and I had been involved for 10 to 15 years in death and dying ministry with people dying of AIDS and of cancer. That was actually how I got into prison ministry. I was asked to come into a large men's prison near Tallahassee to minister to men in prison dying of AIDS. And then in 1998, the church asked if we would make a long-term commitment to death row. The priest who'd been handling Florida's death row for the Catholic Church for 15 years, his health had broken down. They needed someone to go cell to cell to cell, and they could not afford to put a priest full-time in death row. We're barely able to cover the parishes that we have. So the idea was if a layman could go cell to cell to cell, the priest could come once a week and say Mass in the chapel. The death row inmates can't attend it, but they can watch it on closed circuit TV. And then the priest can come for confessions and come for last rites for the executions or when people die of natural causes on death row. So we considered that, and it seemed to both my wife and my children and myself that this was in fact what God had prepared us for. And we said yes. What did I find when I came to Florida's death row? The cells are 6 foot wide and 9 foot deep. That's it. Virtually every man can stand in the middle of his cell and touch both sides with his hands. There's a stainless steel toilet in one corner with a sink in the top. And on this side is a bunk. You could call it that. You and I wouldn't call it that. We wouldn't sleep on it. It's a stainless steel shelf bolted into the wall with a mattress about that thick. You know the story of the Princess and the Pea? Has anyone heard that story? It's the same logic. It's for security. If somebody in one of those cells was able to make a weapon, and usually it's a shank or a shiv, short knives that you can stick in somebody at close range, the officers, me. If someone were able to make or acquire one of those, the only place in the cell where they could hide it would be under the mattress. So the staff have to be able to look into the cell from the door and see whether there's anything under the mattress with a sheet on it. That's how thin the mattress has to be. Also, these prisons were built over World War II Navy dumps that were abandoned. They're in the middle of nowhere. It's swamp. It's very, very isolated. Every time it rains, the fire ants swarm into the building. So if I come at 8 in the morning and the men are just waking up, they will ask me to wait a second while they take the rolled up toilet paper out of their ears and out of their nostrils, because they put that in when they go to sleep at night so that the ants can't get into the orifices on their head. Some of them sleep with their hands over their eyes so that their eyes are protected too. Believe it or not, I have people tell me we're treating them better than they deserve. Did I mention there's no air conditioning? Has anybody here ever been to Gainesville, Florida, University of Florida during the summer? There's a reason it's called the swamp. It's not just because they're the Gators. It's called the swamp because that part of Florida has the highest thermal index in the country from the beginning of July till September 15, higher than Louisiana. That's where these prisons are. And there's no air conditioning. It's like meeting men in a solar furnace. I never knew any of this existed. I used to support the death penalty 30 years ago, but I didn't know anything about it, and I didn't know anything about how we treat the people who we are holding in cages until we kill them. You see, there's a fundamental question here that we have to deal with that no other Western democratic society in the world has to deal with. Because you only have to deal with it if you have the death penalty. We're the only Western democracy in the world that still has the death penalty. The question is, what's our standard of care for human beings that we are holding in small cages until we kill them? What is our standard of care? Some people say, well, they're animals. Well, no. They all have names. I know the name of all 400 men on Florida's death row. They have names. You ask them their names. I don't ask a dog his name. I ask the person that owns him his name. When I walk up to somebody and say, hi, I'm Brother Dale. What's your name? I only do that because I'm talking to a human being. So saying they're animals doesn't work. They're human beings. Now, they're human beings that for the most part did really horrible things. But that doesn't make them stop being human beings, does it? And the fact of the matter is, even if one insists they're animals, at least in Florida, if you or I had a pet dog, or a sheep, or a llama, and we held it in those conditions through July and August and the first half of September, we would be guilty of a felony that we could go to prison for. So that answer doesn't answer it either. Even if you say, well, they're animals, it doesn't help because it's against the law to treat an animal like that. So what's our standard of care for people we're holding in cages until we kill them? There's another thing that's unique to human beings, and that's our extended families, isn't it? I assume all of you have extended families. You weren't found in a cabbage patch. A mother, a father, brothers and sisters. At some point, most of us have children. I have 5, age 30 to 42. Many people my age have grandchildren. I have 8 with 1 more on the way. This is a circle of human beings that surround a human being. I had never heard about the families of the condemned. Have you? I'd never seen a newspaper article, a TV show, a report, a documentary about the families of the condemned. I got to meet them. And I got to meet them under the most difficult of circumstances, because after I had been doing this work for about 1.5 years, I got a call from the warden. Brother Dale, you know so-and-so. You've been seeing him at cell front for about 1.5 years. His warrant's been signed. The governor signed it this morning. He is set to be killed 2 weeks before Christmas. Now, the warden would never use the word killed. Nobody uses that. We say execute. We say execute like execute is different than killing somebody. Maybe that makes us feel better about it. But the death certificate of the person that man killed says cause of death, homicide. The killing of a human being by another human being. And when this man is executed, and the medical examiner in Bradford County certifies the cause of death, it says cause of death, homicide. Because homicide, legally and medically, is the killing of a human being by another human being. So he committed homicide, and we're going to prove what he did was wrong by committing homicide on him. Have you ever heard the saying, I can't hear what you're preaching because your actions are speaking too loud? People used to say the death penalty was to deter crime. Nobody even argues that with a straight face anymore. Even death penalty proponents don't try to argue it, because all the statistics show something quite different. In states that are side by side, the one that has the death penalty continues to have a higher homicide rate than the one that doesn't. The one that has the death penalty continues to have a higher rate of homicide against law enforcement officers than the state that doesn't. Our criminal statisticians and criminologists who make the theories that explain the numbers call it the brutalization effect. That when government and the people's elected leaders set the example that the way to solve our problems is to get rid of people, the population gets the message. And when they're dealing with a problem, they use the same approach. It's called the brutalization effect. You did a homicide, so we're going to homicide you. Long before coming to death row, my wife and I, Susan and I, had for 10 years ministered to families of murder victims. We still do. The agony is unbelievable. We have, on more than one occasion, many, many times, more than I ever want to recount, sat with the mother and the father or the grandparents or the brothers and sisters in their living room the evening of the day that they found out their loved one had been murdered. Let me tell you something. You never want to walk that walk. These crimes are horrible. These crimes are vicious. These crimes tear people's lives apart. But see, once the offender is apprehended and sentenced and in prison and incapable of doing more harm to society, now the shoe's on our foot. How do we respond? Do we respond the way the criminal did? Do we kill because he killed? Or do we respond based on who we are and what we believe and what we stand for? That's the fundamental issue. My opposition to the death penalty is not based on the crimes not being that bad. They're horrible than I even want to talk about. But I don't want to become like that in response. I want to stay consistent to what I believe and to who I want to be while I respond to what this person did. So we knew about the families of murder victims, but I'd never heard about the families of the condemned. So when the warden called and said, "Brother Dale, will you be his spiritual advisor for his execution? Yes or no?" I've learned that you don't say absolutely. That's not yes or no. The first time he asked, I said absolutely. He said, "Brother Dale, that's not a yes or a no." I said, "Excuse me, warden." "Yes, sir." "Thank you." Then I jumped in the car and drove down to the prison to find out what exactly I had to do to be spiritual advisor for an execution. The man has been put in the death house where he's in a death row cell 10 feet from the room where he will be killed. He'll be there 5 to 6 weeks. Usually it's so if there's any last-minute appeals, they can be filed. But it also provides an opportunity for a spiritual advisor to assist him. And the warden said, "Your job is to get him ready to be executed. I hope it's okay with you if I say killed." So I was going to be responsible to help him get ready spiritually to be killed by other human beings. And I would have 12 hours a week with him in the death house at his cell. On the day of the execution, when his family came to say goodbye, I was to be in the visit with him and his family. And then they have to leave at 12 noon. And I'm with him in the death house for 3 hours, 4 hours that afternoon until the death squad comes. At that point, they're called the Strapdown team. Their job is to take him to the other side and strap him down to the gurney to be killed. And then I'm brought around into the witness room, right in front of the glass. The man is only allowed 2 witnesses, his lawyer and his spiritual advisor. More often than not, the lawyers are in their offices trying to get a stay to stop the execution. And so it's usually just the spiritual advisor. Everybody else in that room, looking at him through that glass, is there to see him be killed. The spiritual advisor is there so that while he's dying, he can look at one person who's there out of love for him. I said, "Warden, what about his family?" "Oh, they're not allowed to be there. Only Texas and the feds in Terre Haute have a separate witness room for the family." I said, "Where does the family go?" He said, "We don't know. Usually they go off to a motel and they wait and watch the TV and see whether or not the execution went through, because sometimes it gets stayed. I said, who takes care of the family? It's not our job, chap. Our job is to make sure they're off the prison grounds at 12 noon. My wife, Susan, could not believe this. And she went to the bishops in Florida and said, if the church will accept it, she would make it her volunteer ministry to take care of the family of the condemned, especially during the execution. And that's when we became a team in this work. Mental illness, oh my gosh. In the Bible Belt, oh, did I mention the Bible Belt? You know, the Bible Belt is the old Confederacy, the slave states, and the border states that had slaves. Over 85% of all the executions in the last 4 years have been in the former Confederate states and the border states that held slaves. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Our modern American death penalty is from the death penalty of slavery. That's where it came from. That's why nobody can get the racial bias out of it. Nobody. The Supreme Court couldn't do it. The state Supreme Courts can't do it. The law schools and the jurists and the politicians haven't been able to do it. A black man who kills a white man in Georgia is 7 times more likely, all things being equal, to get a death sentence than a white man who kills a black man in Georgia. In my state of Florida, which has had the death penalty by government for over 300 years, since it was a territory, in that entire time, the scholars have shown from the records, there's never been a white person executed for killing a black person. Never. But that also has to do with the mentally ill. Because in the Bible Belt, mental illness is not accepted as a disease. They pay it lip service in the legislatures to get the federal dollars. But everybody knows from the churches they go to and from where they grow up that mental illness is a moral defect because you let Satan play with your mind. And so to remove the penalties and the agony of mental illness from somebody is to literally take away the consequences of sin. That's why across the Bible Belt, the states with the least amount of money for mental health are the Bible Belt states. The same states with the highest execution rates. And guess who we execute? With regularity. The severely mentally ill. I had one stretch of 12 executions under a prior governor, and out of those 12, 7 were medically diagnosed as severely mentally ill. When they committed their crimes, when they came to death row, and when they were executed. The standard to be competent to be executed under current law is, do you know you're going to be dead and what that means? Yes. And do you know it's because you did something bad? Yes. If the state can get 3 psychiatrists to testify that this person knows what it means to be dead and that they're going to be dead because they did something bad, they're competent to be executed. Guess who else we like to execute? Veterans. Veterans of the armed services. Finally, somebody's talking about it. Finally, on Veterans Day last year in November, a report came out of Washington, D.C. that 10% of all the men and women on death row in America are veterans of Americans Armed Services who came home broken and damaged on the inside. I never could figure out. You know, I am one-on-one pastoral counseling with about 40 or 50 men on death row. I see them almost every month. This isn't Death Watch. This is just pastoral counseling as a spiritual advisor. I've got a guy that was at Chosun Reservoir in North Korea. I've got chunks of Vietnam vets, infantrymen, Air Force ground crews. I've got people from Persian Gulf War. I've got a forward observer from Iraq. I've got veterans of Afghanistan, and I've got veterans from every place, every foreign adventure we've had. What are all these veterans doing on death row? You know how they get on death row? Now, they committed a crime, they committed a murder, they've got to be dealt with. They should be punished. But the prosecutors in the death penalty states, I guess we could call them the killing states, read the record of their service at the sentencing trial to the jury and tell the jury a person who's able to do these things in battle is too dangerous to be free in society, and we need to execute them. The day after that report came out, 3 retired generals wrote an open letter, an op-ed in USA Today, and demanded that Congress hold hearings on why prosecutors in death penalty states target veterans who've been convicted of murder for death sentences and use their service record frequently. They read from the commendations for their battle medals for victory, and not victory, but courage in battle. They read that to the jury to get a death sentence. As far as I know, no committee's been set up to look into that. Nobody wants to be accused of being soft on crime, like that has anything to do with crime. What about the innocent? You know, people tell me, I support the death penalty. I say, what about the innocent? Well, I don't support the execution of the innocent. Well, then you don't support the death penalty. You support some myth, some fantasy that doesn't exist. Our 2 most pro-death penalty Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, God rest his soul, told us in a written opinion in the case of Troy v. Davis, if you have the death penalty, you will execute innocent people. Because our criminal justice system is a human system, and human systems make mistakes. If you want to make sure you never execute an innocent person, you must get rid of the death penalty, but don't come asking the Supreme Court to do it. That's not in our purview. It must be done by the legislatures and the voters in the states. They handed the hot potato back to us. Somebody tells me, I support the death penalty, but I don't support the execution of the innocent. I'm sorry, you have to pick between the available options. The death penalty we have executes innocent people. I've been spiritual advisor to a man that I knew was innocent, an Agent Orange Vietnam vet. Lived on the wrong side of the tracks in a small panhandle town. I was there in the morning when each of his daughters in their 20s hugged him goodbye. And they were so traumatized that I had to carry them one by one across the hall to where my wife was waiting to help them, while they cried at the top of their lungs, too paralyzed to walk, cried at the top of their lungs. Why do they have to kill my daddy? Why can't they just let him live in prison? Why indeed? Why indeed? Who's it for? Florida would save $55 million a year if we junked the death penalty and just had life without parole. And that's after taking into account the cost of incarceration for life. Here in Oregon, you're paying $28 million a year to have a death penalty that you don't even use. It costs a fortune. It costs a fortune. It's a luxury car that never leaves the garage. Anybody who could talk dispassionately about the execution of the innocent has never watched an innocent man be executed. I thought that was as bad as it could get. And then just 6 weeks later, I was the spiritual advisor for Angel Diaz, Florida's infamous botched lethal injection. And for over half an hour, I watched this man who in the morning, when his family was there, we had held a communion service in the visiting park where they said goodbye. And I was with him in the death house just a couple hours before, teaching the death watch officers the songs from Cursillo. He was a Curcillista at 17 years old in Puerto Rico. And we were teaching the Cursillo songs to the officers. And now I'm watching for over half an hour as he writhes and arches on the gurney to the point where I thought he would bust the straps until he finally died. On my way home, I called my wife. She didn't know it was me. She said she couldn't recognize my voice. She did say, "What happened?" I said, "I just watched a man be tortured to death." Now, when my nightmares started, I didn't feel entitled to have nightmares, and I told my wife so. I said, "I shouldn't be having nightmares. It was just a lethal injection." Father Joe, whose health collapsed, one of the reasons was he had witnessed in 1997 a botched electrocution. And as he was sitting there in front of the window with the man he had been with all day, praying, the flames erupted 3 feet into the air, right out of his head. And he screamed as he burned to death alive in the chair. When I took this work, Father Joe told me those nightmares wouldn't leave his dreams. He and I get together at least twice a year, because when you do this, you got to get together with somebody else who really understands what you're talking about. And he still can't get those nightmares out of his dreams. And I told my wife, I shouldn't be having nightmares. I watched a botched lethal injection. Father Joe watched a botched electrocution. And she reminded me that the autopsy of Angel Diaz after his execution showed that he had a 13-inch long burn in one arm, 11 inches long in the other, worse than third degree, total burn of all the tissue from the bone to the skin. The ports had been put in incorrectly. The chemicals were not going into his bloodstream, they were going into his tissue. And of course the state has a protocol. He's not dead yet, pump in some more. Until enough leached back into his bloodstream that he died of a heart attack. And my wife, who's always right, guys, if you remember nothing else, remember this when you get married. Your wife is always right, okay? My wife says to me, Dale, what's the difference between burning a person to death from the outside in with electricity and burning a person to death from the inside out with chemicals? And of course, there is no difference. I have to own my nightmares, and they start up again every time I get asked to be on death watch. I can tell you that even though Scalia and Thomas didn't say it in their opinion, if you have the death penalty, you will have botched executions. It doesn't matter what method you use, because executions are done by human beings, and human beings make mistakes, and there's no nice way to kill people. So who's all this for? It's a good question. It's a good question. We're running out of time. I just want to point out to you that an awful lot of people in the Bible Belt, which is where this is being used, honestly believe that if they go against the death penalty, they'll be going against God, because they've been told their whole life the death penalty's in the Bible. You need to know that that's the argument that was made to support slavery in the 1800s, long before the Civil War. From the churches, people were hearing that to go against slavery is to go against God, because slavery's in the Bible. And people who were seeking to get rid of slavery in the Bible Belt were called infidels because they weren't accepting God's will that we're supposed to hold people in slavery. It's in the Bible. Well, there is a death penalty in the Bible. I wrote that first book after 5 years of research, but it has nothing to do with what we're doing. Nothing at all. You can't support the death penalty we have with what's in the Bible. What's in the Bible condemns the death penalty we have. Because the first command of the biblical death penalty was, "Thou shalt not execute an innocent person." Exodus 23:7. Everything else flowed from that. And our Supreme Court has told us there's no constitutional right to not be executed just because you're innocent. Don't run by that one. Let it sit. There's no constitutional right to not be executed just because you're innocent. That's as much God's will as I don't know what. Of course it's not God's will, and of course it's not in the Bible. The Bible condemned the execution of the innocent. So we have a practice that goes back to the Bronze Age. And we're the only Western democracy in the world that's still using it. It's so prehistoric. And it's time to junk it. And I'm here from Florida to ask you to get rid of it here in Oregon because you're not using it. It's costing you a fortune. It'll be easier for you to get rid of it. And when you in Wyoming and Utah and Idaho and New Hampshire and Montana and all these other states that are keeping it on the books but aren't using it and are paying big bucks to have it, say, you got to be kidding, get rid of it. We'll have more states that have repealed the death penalty than states that have it. And once that happens, this is no longer constitutionally permissible. And it'll be gone for the whole country. So I'm asking you, please, get informed. Draw on the resources you've got. Get involved with Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Make your voices heard. Inform the people that are around you, at home, at church, at school. Because once people know the facts about the death penalty, they don't want any part of it. And get rid of it here. And when you get rid of it here and other states get rid of it, we will get rid of it in the entire country. It means to be a relic of our past. It has no place in our present, and we certainly don't want to saddle you and your children with this barbaric practice. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Question is, how many women on death row in Florida? I'm sorry, I was trying to keep with the time. We have 400 men and 5 women. The 5 women on death row in Florida are at a different facility down by Ocala. But when their warrant is signed, their death warrant for them to be executed, they are moved to this prison because this is the only death house for the whole state. And so the chaplains at Florida State Prison are responsible for the spiritual needs of the men and the women in the death house because that's where they'll be brought when it's time for their execution.
You were talking about how the old laws in the Bible had to do with slavery and execution stuff, but aren't those part of very, very old covenants that aren't even, like, you're using the New Testament, it's not even better.
Yeah. The 420-page book, The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty, goes through what you're referring to there. There is a death penalty under the biblical law in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, what I did in my research is I identified what were the requirements procedurally, meaning how it's done, and substantively, meaning what you get the death penalty for, under the biblical death penalty when it was the law of the land. And I didn't worry about, stoning. I'm not talking about do we stone them or do we... No, that wasn't the kind of things I was looking at. I was looking at it as a lawyer. What was the legal regimen that you had to satisfy in order to be able to have a capital case under the biblical death penalty. For example, confessions were prohibited. Can you believe that 1,000 years before Christ, the Jewish leaders would not allow a confession in a capital case because people who are mentally deficient or emotionally ill will confess to things they didn't do? We routinely are executing people where all we've got is their confession and circumstantial evidence. And oh, by the way, that's the other thing that was prohibited under the biblical death penalty. You couldn't have circumstantial evidence. It had to be direct evidence. And no one who testified as to direct evidence could have anything to gain from their testimony. I challenge you, I challenge anybody to go through the cases of the 3,000 people on death row in America and find 10 where the state hasn't used someone to testify and given them a deal in exchange for their testimony. In Florida, we have felony murder, which means if I commit a crime and somebody dies, it's as if I intended to kill them, and so it's death eligible. Routinely in Florida, we have situations where you have 2 or 3 co-defendants in a felony murder case. The one who actually pulled the trigger gets a deal for 15 years, and the other 2 go to death row based on his testimony that they were involved. In 1982, the American Bar Association Journal had an article, and it said, if you have a client who's been involved with other defendants in committing a capital crime, run, don't walk to the prosecutor's office, because the first one to get there will get a deal for testimony, and the other ones will get a death sentence. Under the biblical death penalty, that was anathema. So I identified 44 of these legal principles under the biblical death penalty. Out of 44, how many does the American death penalty comply with? Goose egg. 0. There's a death penalty in the Bible, but it has nothing to do with what we're doing. And in Illinois, before Governor Ryan commuted the entire death row to life, because he realized the system was so flawed, he couldn't be sure that anyone he's signing a death warrant for actually had committed the crime. They set up a blue ribbon panel to fix Illinois' death penalty. They came up with 85 things that they said had to be done in order to make the system work, so that you knew the person that was going to be executed was guilty and morally culpable. The prosecutors said, this is a joke. If we follow these, we won't be able to get death sentences. It'll be too hard. They refused to support it. The legislature responded by repealing it. I'm telling you, we can't support what we've got with the Bible. There is a death penalty in the Bible, but you can't stop there. You got to ask yourself, what was required? And we do not meet what was required.
So I was just wondering your opinion on if the alternative to death penalty is life without parole. Do you believe in rehabilitative programs as well? And if so, what should the government do in helping these individuals go through the process of integrating back into society so that they don't relapse in these crimes or feel discouraged, etc.?
Now you're getting into my next book, which is coming out in September, When We Visit Jesus in Prison, and it's about restorative justice. I do believe in life in prison without possibility of parole, not indiscriminately, but in the cases where the offender is incapable of living outside a severely restrictive environment without doing harm. And I've just got to be frank with you, I have encountered many men who fit that profile. I don't condemn them, I don't judge them, I don't say God wants them in hell. What I do say is, they are not capable, even with everything we know how to do, of coming to a point where they can live free without doing harm. But our responsibility in that case doesn't stop there. If we need to keep them behind bars, we need to make what's behind bars humane. And we need to provide community to them in their situation and help find ways for them to have a meaningful life in their situation. That's challenging. That is really challenging. It's much easier to talk about how many people we executed and say I'm tough on crime. It's challenging to figure out how to make a difference one life at a time. Now, even with the number of men I've encountered like that, they are a small portion of the people we're holding in prison. In Florida, we have 120,000 adults in prison. In state prison, that doesn't count federals, it doesn't count ICE detention, it doesn't count local pokies. That's state prisons. We have 120,000 people in state prison. Most of those people can be helped by rehabilitation, by relearning. There are very effective programs on reversing criminal thinking. One of the most respected authors on reversing criminal thinking is from right here in Oregon, Boyd Sharp, from, is it Umatilla? Yeah, I think he passed away recently. His books and guidebooks and workbooks on reversing criminal thinking are being used all over the world. We can do that. But for some reason, legislators are afraid that if they talk about money for rehabilitation instead of money to make people suffer, they'll get the reputation for being soft on crime. The reason conservatives against the death penalty and conservatives concerned about the death penalty are saying we need to get rid of this is because they've woken up and realized that the death penalty is a massive government bureaucratic program that burns money with no accountability for outcomes. But when they talk about putting that money into things that make a difference, like rehabilitation and reentry programs and job training, the legislators are afraid they're going to be accused of being soft on crime. We've got to fix that. We can't stop politicians from going to see which way the wind's blowing. We've got to change the direction of the wind. Our elected officials need to know that we want real solutions to crime, not tripe. We want real solutions to crime, and that requires what you're talking about, restorative justice, rehabilitation, and programs that help people make it in society. A few presidential campaigns ago, one of the candidates who'd been a governor in a southern state said, we're going to go bankrupt imprisoning all the people we're mad at. We need to only imprison the people that we're properly afraid of. And that's the only thing I quote from that particular candidate, but that is exactly what I'm saying. We need to distinguish between the people who can be helped and are capable of living a meaningful life outside the prison fence and find a way to make a meaningful life for the people who can't do that inside the prison fence. In the book, Now I Walk on Death Row, the second book, I knew if it was just about death row and the death house, it was going to be so oppressive, people were not going to be able to take it. There needed to be a message of hope. And so through the whole book, I parallel our experiences on death row with a man named Kenny, a man I met as a prayer partner in the prison chapel in 1991, who had originally faced the electric chair and missed the electric chair by one jury vote in Florida. Because until last week in Florida, you could be sentenced to death 7-5. He was 7-5 for life at 19 years old. And when I met him, after a few months, I sensed there was something in this young man that could be salvaged. And after 20 years as his prayer partner and our family becoming a Christian mentoring family to him, my wife and I picked him up at Everglades Correctional, south of Miami, the day he was paroled after 29 years in prison. still a 19-year-old boy in a 50-year-old man's body, and took him to Jacksonville and put him in a reentry program. And he's been out now for 5 years. He's a security guard at a Christian ministry in Jacksonville. He's happily married. He's helping to raise his grandsons through marriage. And he gives testimonies in churches all over Florida that men in prison can be saved. They can be salvaged. We just have to have the political will to do it. So I think that's what you're talking about. And in that second book, that's the story I weave through all the death row stuff so that people know there is hope and there are resurrection stories. We just need to make sure there's more of them.
You said several times that the cost of executing people far exceeds the cost of keeping them in prison. And I'd like you to kind of unpack a little bit how that could be possible. It seems intuitively not obvious.
You're right, and I'll make it quick. It is counterintuitive. In fact, the article I published in the statewide newspaper of the Catholic bishops in Florida on this subject was titled, "Maybe You Can Fool All the People All of the Time." I would never have believed what I discovered accidentally by attending conferences on the death penalty to get my continuing legal education credits that I need to keep my law license. I'm a licensed Florida lawyer. I can't practice law while I'm doing this, but I'm a licensed Florida lawyer. I keep my license. I attended a conference for state attorneys, not the defense, state attorneys in death penalty cases. They had jumbotrons showing the attorneys sitting in 11 rooms around the state of Florida. And the company that had been hired to do the electronics and the whiz-bang stuff for this conference, in addition to the 200 were sitting in the room I was in, Lake Buena Vista, that's Disney World, Lake Buena Vista in Florida, in the center of Florida, the manager of this whole thing from this company got up and said proudly, "This is the largest live teleconference in the history of Florida." And it was all about minutia of death penalty cases for attorneys on the state side. The reason it costs so much more to get an execution than it does to keep people in prison the rest of their life is very simple. Lawyers wear Brooks Brothers suits and officers wear department issue uniforms. The money all goes to lawyers. And it starts at the initial trial. I assumed it started with the appeals. It starts at the initial trial. If a person pleads guilty and accepts life without parole, the cost to the state is about $75,000 to $50,000. If the state has to go to trial to get a life sentence without parole, it'll probably run about $125,000 to $175,000. And I'm talking Florida here. A death penalty trial starts at $1 million, and that's the trial. And then you have super due process applies, which means there's more appeals, there's collateral appeals, there's federal reviews. By the time you get done, most states are showing that it costs $3 million to $3.5 million per execution. And it would have cost $700,000 to $800,000 to keep the person in prison at the highest level of security for the rest of their life. It all goes to lawyers. So when I talk in Florida, I say our death penalty system in Florida is a welfare to work program for lawyers who can't do anything else on the state side. Let's get rid of the welfare program and put them to work doing things that'll make society better. And believe it or not, people get excited about that. Thank you very much.
Night is a
That was Dale Resinella, the chaplain on death row in Florida state prisons for 18 years and the author of 3 books on the death penalty. He spoke at Willamette University in March. The talk was sponsored by Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Thanks to Alan Taylor for his help with this program. Find out more about Oregonians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty at oadp.org. You're tuned to KBOO Portland. The time is 9:59. Stay right here at Community Radio for Flashpoints at 10:15. And at 11 on the Recovery Zone, host Stephanie Potter interviews Perry Gruber, founder of the group Copiosis. It's a resource-based economic system about retiring capitalism and repairing our world. In just a moment, it's Air Cascadia, headlines and commentary with your host, Chris Andre.
Why everything's the same as it was.
2 or 3 hours after I left church, I heard this noise, and they were saying the dike has broken.
KBOO Community Radio is a proud co-sponsor of the Vanport Mosaic Festival May 27th through May 30th, celebrating the preservation of the history of Vanport and its residents. The Vanport Mosaic Festival is 4 days of art, culture, historical exhibits, lectures, and tours that will engage audiences in a deeper understanding of this chapter in Portland's history. This includes screenings of short documentary films, performances of Cottonwood in the Flood, and much, much more. Again, the Vanport Mosaic Festival is May 27th through May 30th, celebrating the preservation of the history of Vanport and its residents, taking place all over the Portland metro area. More information can be found at kboo.fm on the right side of the homepage under Community Events.